here. We're up on the stage at the Heartland Cafe, where every Saturday morning we bring you another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. It's a very gray and white scene out there. The streets are pretty clear, so if you want to get some good talking in, listening in, come on over, and we're here. Good morning, Katie. I'm Michael. There's Katie.
Good morning, Michael. I'm Katie. There's Michael.
All right. We got a good lineup today. We've got two guests. We're going to take up the whole hour. We'll make a few announcements in between, but we've got Michael Deutsch, and he is one of the three lawyers who was on the case of the NATO 3, and the verdict has come down, and these guys were not convicted of terrorism. So let's hear a little bit about it. Good morning to you, Mike.
Good morning. Thank you.
Let's hear it for the lawyer here, huh?
Well, first of all, how are these guys? They've been in jail for a couple years. There are three of them. There were five. The other two made some earlier deal. How are the guys doing, and how do they feel?
Well, they've been in prison at Cook County Jail since May 16th of 2012, so it's almost coming up on 2 years. They've been held in what they call protective custody because of their terrorism charges. They're doing as well as can be expected under those conditions. They're holding up well, they look well, and of course the terrorism charges have been rejected by a jury from the city of Chicago. Despite the statements of Anita Alvarez and the police, there was never a basis for terrorism. We said that from the very beginning, but they used the terrorism charges to justify all the money they spent on security for NATO, to say, see, there was going to be terrorism, that's why we needed it. They also brought those terrorism charges because they wanted to intimidate people from going to the mass demonstration on May 20th on Sunday, and they wanted people to be fearful. And this was a calculated political prosecution that never should have been brought. The Sun-Times even brought an editorial denouncing it.
Well, it is good news that these kind of overbearing charges did not come to fruition on the...
Yeah, nice work, Michael Deutsch.
Thank you. And let me just be clear. There was Durkin and Molly Armour and Sarah Gelsomino, who was my co-counsel, and Lily McCartan, who was the co-counsel with Paul Brayman for one of them, and Tom Durkin and Josh Herman, who was also one of the attorneys. We had a great legal team that all worked together.
To all of them, good work. Although we still have guys in jail, and you know, the only difference being that we've got a lot of guys in jail for doing even less than these guys did, and usually they are of color. So the difference is...
Absolutely.
What are the charges that they were convicted of?
They were convicted of two different counts, which are basically the same thing, of possession of an incendiary device, which is a bottle with gasoline in it, which they call a Molotov cocktail, with the intent to commit arson. And that's a very serious charge. It has possible 4 to 30-year sentence. The reality is it was the undercover agents who suggested doing this, who went to get the gasoline with one of the defendants, who put the wick in there, and who filled the bottle with gasoline. So it was really these undercover police officers that created this crime. But in fact, the evidence showed that these guys went along with it to a certain extent, and that's what the jury found them guilty of that charge. Hopefully, the judge will see the ridiculousness of this whole terrorism prosecution and give them a sentence which would result in them having to do very little more time in jail. But 4 to 30 years is the possible sentence.
If you were a betting man, what do you think will happen? Are you allowed to do that?
I wouldn't bet, but hopefully, in Cook County and in Illinois, every day in jail you get a day credit. So already they are in almost 2 years, that's 4 years. So if the judge gave them 6 years, they'd have to do 3 years, which would mean they have to do 1 more year in jail. That's what I would be hopeful for. Even if he gave them 8 years, they would only have to do 2 more years in jail. So we've taken a situation where they were looking at possible 40 years for terrorism, and now it's going to be reduced to maybe 1 or 2 more years in jail.
Michael, when will we know this? When is the actual sentencing, and
The sentencing date is not set. There is a court date of February 28th, which is for post-trial motions, and then there'll be a date set for sentencing, probably sometime in March. And I would encourage people, and we will put out a formal request for people to write letters to the judge in support of a lenient sentence, and hopefully, as we had through the trial, fill the courtroom with their supporters. They had some incredible people who were supporting them, who stayed in court. We were in court many days till 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and people sat in that courtroom and they're supporting them. They were part of the whole Occupy movement.
Right.
A couple of them had been in Occupy encampments in Washington, D.C., in Boston, in Miami. So they were really legitimate protesters who came here with the idea that if they were going to protest in Chicago, they had to defend themselves against the police. And they had some very far-out ideas of how to do that. But essentially, they were not here to cause terrorism to the city of Chicago. They were here to create some kind of defensive posture towards the police and try to figure out a way to defend the protesters from the police. That was what they were saying mostly on these undercover tapes. But as you heard in the newspaper, these undercover cops were busy for months before this, going to all these venues, including the Heartland Cafe, trying to listen to people's conversations to see if there was anybody talking about anarchism. They were looking for anarchism at rock concerts, at coffee shops, even going up and down Division Avenue looking at graffiti and seeing if they could find out where the anarchists were. It was ridiculous. But the reason they were able to do that, spy on people engaged in just First Amendment activity, is because there was once a consent decree against the police in the city for all the Red Squad spying that went on in the 60s and the early 70s. And then they took that consent decree away several years ago, and now the police have the right, at least without that consent decree, to look for people's conversations to determine whether they're plotting and planning possible criminal activity.
Well, that worked well for them, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
It takes a lot of effort to make up a pretend revolution. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Mike. In the way the trial was covered, it was, the prosecutions tried to make them out to be terrorists. The defense seemed to make them out to be just as kind of wild, carefree, kind of young dudes.
Goofy.
Goofy, or whatever. There were a couple
Goofy.
terms used which don't come right to mind. But what's your sense of these three gentlemen, or young fellows, or prisoners, or partially convicted guys, however we refer to them?
I think there were differences among them. Like one of them was much more politically active and had some kind of political history of being with Occupy. My client was 20 years old. This is the first demonstration he'd ever been at. He said that on the thing. I don't really know anything. This is my first experience with all of this. And he's had some kind of wacky ideas about what he could do, which he never was able to even take any step to try and accomplish. They had this idea that because Obama hadn't spoken out about police brutality, they wanted to do some kind of action against the Obama campaign headquarters, which is in the Prudential building. But they couldn't even Google it to find out where it was. So they said to the undercover agents, well, we don't know where it is. Where is it? And then the undercover agents told them where it was, and then they said, okay, we're going to go out and look at it and see what we can do there. They were talking about taking a slingshot with marbles and breaking a window.
I love
the
that.
window in the Obama headquarters is on the 6th floor.
Right.
They had a wooden, like
Perfect.
this big, 5-inch slingshot. And then one of the guys said, well, maybe we could break the windows with a metal pipe. You know where we could get a metal pipe? Well, they turned that into, they were looking to make a pipe bomb. This is how they twisted the words of these guys. So they were going to go out and look at it, and then 2 days later, the undercover agent said, well, you did the recon on that? Oh, no, we got drunk and never went there. So they never even went to the Obama headquarters to look at it. And there were, one time, my client who had brought a bow and arrow with him, he was kind of like a
I love that, too.
Yeah, ninja.
These are real pacifist
collector.
weapons.
He said, I'm going to shoot an arrow at Rahm Emanuel's house and put a note on it. Of course, that never happened. He never mentioned it again.
No, because they had to wait for their weed connection, right?
Yeah, exactly. And most of the time, at one point, the undercover agent says to my client, "Hey, man, are you stoned?" He said, "Yeah, I'm stoned." So then he tells him, "Look, before you hit the bowl in the morning, why don't you make a list of what you want to do?" And so then on cross-examination, I asked the other undercover agent, "Didn't he say that this guy was stoned and before he hit the bowl in the morning, make a list?" And she says, "Oh, bowl, I thought he was saying before you go to the bathroom, make a list." So, I mean, they were just ridiculous. And anybody that looked at that evidence would have said these guys are so far away from being terrorists. But they had an agenda here. Anita Alvarez, McCarthy, the police chief, and Rahm Emanuel had an agenda. They needed to find a boogeyman to justify all this money and all this security. And I think we have to really think about this Anita Alvarez, because we have the Koshman case, which my partner was involved in. I think he's coming on
Actually,
next
Flynn will
week.
be on the radio next week.
About how they covered up this crime because of the relationship with Mayor Daley. This case, how she's slow to exonerate people, and she is a disaster as the state's attorney of Cook
Well,
County.
she seemed to lose it yesterday, and when she was defending about how this was not a loss, really, and I don't know if it was. I read it this morning, but you know, she seemed to get pretty emotional and upset that they had lost the case.
Well, yeah, I'm sure.
And she compared it to have people forgot about Boston? Yeah, and she somehow compared this to these guys who never had anything but slingshots and bottle rockets. You know what a bottle rocket is?
Yes.
This is what they call a mortar. A bottle rocket is a little firecracker that you put
On a stick.
On a chopstick.
Yeah, on a
That you put in a bottle.
Yeah, you put in
and
a
you
bottle,
light it, and you go 10 feet away and
yeah.
go, woo!
But they took these.
And then you go, oh, darn,
these
a
plastic
dud.
pipes.
Calm down, Katie.
They put in a plastic pipe which has a little hole, and they put the bottle rocket in, and they shot it in the air. They called this a mortar. And then when the undercover agent wanted to see, let's see the mortar gun, my guy said, "Oh man, we already made that into a flagpole." And they took all the pipes, and they had a flag, an anarchist flag, and American flag, and that was the mortar gun. And then at one time, my guy said, "Oh, we're going to make a potato gun." What's a potato gun? And the undercover says, "Well, I got 2 pounds of potatoes, so I can pitch into that." They never made a potato gun.
You're listening to the Live from the Heartland show, and we're here with People's Law Office lawyer Michael Deutsch, one of the lawyers on the NATO 3 case that a verdict came in yesterday. And while the 3 defendants were found guilty of, I think, mob action.
Mob action, which is a Class C misdemeanor. The maximum sentence is 30 days in jail.
And the other, they got also found victim of making an incendiary device, but they were acquitted of all the terrorism charges. Michael, give me a little bit of background about how the terrorism charges came to be. I know they followed 9/11, but these were state charges, and
Right.
the state's attorney for the county, I think, brought the charges on a state level, which I didn't quite understand.
Well, after 9/11, the Illinois legislature passed domestic terrorism law. And basically the law says that you have to commit a terrorist act, and they define a terrorist act as any intent to cause damage or death to more than one person. But you have to commit the terrorist act, get this, with the intent to coerce or intimidate a significant portion of the civilian population. So in other words, whatever you do, whatever act you commit, and our guys never committed any act, you have to intend to intimidate a significant portion of the civilian population. So even though we challenge that statute and we think it's vague and unconstitutional, it's a fairly demanding statute, because you have to show that somehow you wanted to not just hurt an individual or hurt a bank building or throw a Molotov cocktail against a police car, but you wanted to intimidate a significant portion of the civilian population. Now, we say the civilian population does not include the police. The police are not civilians. Certainly doesn't include the military. But the judge found, very strangely, but never told the jury, that civilians include the police. But even if you were trying to throw a Molotov cocktail at a policeman, which there's no evidence that that was in the case, it wouldn't intimidate a significant portion of the civilian population. So they had this very demanding terrorist statute, and this is the first time they ever used it since it was passed in 2011, after 9/11. And it was Anita Alvarez and the police chief and the mayor and the high-ups in the state's attorney's office that decided to bring this charge of terrorism. And that's allowed them to have this huge press conference when these guys were arrested and say all these things that they were going to do and then ask for $5 million bail. And it created this atmosphere that was on the eve of the major NATO demonstrations. And I believe many people probably stayed away because they were fearful that there was going to be violence at that demonstration. The only violence that happened at the demonstration were the police, pushing and shoving and hitting demonstrators.
Michael Deutsch, could you tell us a little bit about the composition of the jury? And I guess it would be interesting to know your feeling about where the jury was going, what your sense of the jury was. And then I would also just, if you could share a little bit on what you know about the judge, if you can talk about that.
Sure. It was a very, it took a long time to pick the jury. There were 2 African Americans, a Hispanic, probably half women and half men. There was a lawyer on the jury. There were 2 architects on the jury. There was a woman on the jury whose grandfather was the police chief of St. Louis, who had close friends that were FBI agents, and she turned out to be the foreman of the jury. And so it was a very intelligent jury, and they were, if you could recall, we had this trial during the worst possible weather, wind chills 30 below, snowstorms. That jury was there every day on time. They took the case very seriously, and any intelligent person, and actually the Sun-Times says in an editorial, where were the adults when these charges were lodged? The adults finally came to the fore when the jury spoke. So these were the real adults in this case. It was the jury, and I think the jury clearly understood that this would be not terrorism, kind of denigrate real terrorism, like, blowing up the World Trade or Oklahoma City, and really kind of trivializes terrorism and makes terrorism a threat to all types of protests.
How about the judge? What was the judge's
judge is
name?
an African-American man. His name is Thaddeus Wilson. He has a picture of Martin Luther King in his courtroom. He has a reputation of being a very law and order judge. He did some very good things for us. He gave us this mob action instruction, which is a lesser included offense of terrorism. In other words, a lesser included offense of terrorism was a Class C misdemeanor that you get 30 days in jail, whereas terrorism is 9 to 40 years. And that was a very important ruling on his part. But he also has a very strong opinion about terrorism. So we'll have to wait and see how he views this case now that the terrorism charges have been thrown out by the jury. And we're hopeful that he'll see that these guys were basically misguided, over-the-top young men who have suffered greatly already for being in Cook County Jail for almost 2 years, and give them the most lenient sentence. He could give them a sentence that would allow them to get out right away. Because there's a minimum of 4 years. That would be 2 years, so they would be out very shortly.
And Michael, you think it would be good for people to write to the judge?
Absolutely. His name's Thaddeus Wilson. He's a Cook County judge. Be respectful, of course, but say that you think that the defendant should be given the most lenient possible sentence. They've suffered enough.
Michael.
And that would be very helpful. In cases I've had, I think letters from the population have been helpful in getting a better sentence.
Michael, one last arena that we were very conscious of when we were covering this as it was going on. and decrying the press role in the lead up to the NATO and what would have been the G8 as well until they iced it, conferences and collections here. I was appalled at the level of hype, anti-hype, if you will, basically scaring people off from demonstrating. Because I think that the more generations that pass through without ever having hit the streets, the worse off our democracy is going to be. What is the role, as far as you could see, as the trial went on? I think the press might have helped your cause.
The press was terrific. Mark Brown, who's an editorial writer from the Sun-Times, wrote some very good and incisive analysis of what was going on, and also wrote about the Heartland and the spying and the infiltration. The Tribune coverage was terrific. It really set the tone. Obviously, we don't know, the jury's not supposed to read the press, so we don't know if it affected the jury, but it really created a tone that this case was overcharged and terrorism was not appropriate. Of course, and then there was the alternative press. There was a guy you had on last week, I think, that talked about it. Kevin Costola.
Fire Dog Lake.
Costola.
Yeah, Costola.
Yeah.
So I think the press really show their good colors in this case.
It's interesting how they can switch from one to the other.
Yeah, I mean, they hear that terrorism and then all of a sudden they're promoting.
Yeah.
But then when they actually see the evidence and you got real people covering it, then it changes.
Even the TV was pretty good. I mean,
it was. Yeah. Chicago Tonight had some good stuff on it. So I think the press really rose to the occasion and was very helpful in this case.
Michael Deutsch.
Nice work.
Great work.
Again, let's hear.
We got about a minute left. I
Right.
want to know what you think we should take away from this. I know here at the Heartland we're talking about having a gathering of the tribes and organizations old and new, and talking about what they're doing, and just seeing if we can work off of this this great outcome. But all the bad stuff leading up to it, and see how we all go forward. What are your take on that kind of thing?
I think it's very important to re-look at this infiltration and spying and use of undercover police and spying on political groups in the city of Chicago. I think they have a green light to do this now that the consent decree has been vacated. And I think we might consider going to court to get a new consent decree, or certainly getting a public reaction to spying on political and community groups. I think that's the important thing that comes out of this case. And of course, we don't use terrorism to charge political protesters, even if they go over the line. There are criminal charges that can be used against them. Terrorism should be reserved for the most serious, clear attack on the civilian population.
Well, we have a long history of even going back to Sacco and Vanzetti of using trials and stuff to try to stomp out protest and change.
Absolutely.
Michael Deutsch, you do great work. All of you at the People's
You deserve a rest, dude.
A whole lot of other people are doing good. We want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And everyone stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're going to talk a little bit about some upcoming events here at the Heartland. And then we're going to have Danny Postal come up and talk about this wonderful new book called The Syria Dilemma. And we'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland. Don't go away. We're here on the left end of the dial.
Thanks.
Good work, man.
Tonight we're going to do another Barb Hale song.
I think this should be my
my
mud
apartment, I'm wearing
It is.
out the carpet.
Okay.
Broke in my new shoes while I was waiting for your call. Last time that I saw you is the last thing I remember.
Yeah, no.
Everything on my mind was my alarm clock hits the wall. Baby,
What's that?
please bring it.
Should have built the stage differently.